The Jaqueth Dominion had a saying. It was old, older than their first warship, older than the first treaty they had ever broken. The saying went like this: the small stay small. It was not a cruel thing to them. It was just a fact. Like gravity, or the cold of deep space. The small stayed small, and the large did what the large always did. They moved, they took, they passed through. That was how Commander Veth Ra of the Jaqueth Dominion thought about it when his fleet of 43 warships crossed into the Kepler corridor. He did not call it an invasion. He did not call it anything, really. It was a transit, a shortcut. The Kepler corridor cut 11 days off the journey from the Dominion's eastern shipyards to its frontier stations. And 11 days mattered when you were moving fuel and weapons and soldiers across the galaxy. The fact that the Kepler corridor was human space was, to Commander Veth Ra, a minor detail. He had checked the records before departure, as any good officer would. He had pulled every file on the species called humanity that the Dominion's Intelligence Bureau had compiled over the past 60 years. The files were thin, not because humanity was new. They had been out among the stars for nearly 2 centuries, but because they were quiet. They built things slowly. They did not expand fast. They did not threaten neighbors. They traded in small amounts. They maintained a handful of stations and colonies along a stretch of space that nobody much wanted, and they kept to themselves. There had been no recorded wars, no major conflicts. Some minor border disputes decades ago, resolved without violence. The Intelligence Bureau's summary read, at the bottom, in the flat language of bureaucracy, low threat assessment, no military capability of note. Commander Veth Ra had read those words and moved on. He filed the transit notification with the Galactic Conclave, as was technically required, though he did not expect it to matter. The Conclave was a body that talked. It talked endlessly, in 42 languages, about treaties and rights, and the dignity of all species. It rarely did anything. He filed the notification 3 hours before his fleet crossed the line, which was not the required 72 hours, but he told himself it was the thought that counted. The Kepler corridor was dark and wide and very cold. Stars were sparse here. It was the kind of space that felt empty, that made even experienced officers feel like they were crossing something that did not want to be crossed. His crew moved through their duties quietly. The engines hummed. The warships, 43 of them, heavy class, armed for serious work, moved in tight formation, their sensor arrays sweeping the dark. Nothing came back on the sensors. Nothing at all. That was normal. That was expected. This was the edge of human space. And human space was quiet. Commander Veth Ra sat in his command chair and drank something hot and thought about the 11 days he was saving and felt quite satisfied with himself. The transmission arrived 6 hours after they crossed the line. It was short. His communications officer read it aloud because she thought, at first, that the translation had failed. It had not. The message said, in Jaqueth Standard, with no greeting and no signature. Current position of Jaqueth Transit Fleet. Confirmed. Corridor exit window. 14.7 standard hours from transmission timestamp. All vessels are advised to maintain current heading and exit the corridor without deviation. This transmission does not constitute acknowledgement of the filed notification, which did not meet the required 72-hour advance window. A formal record of this violation has been logged. And then the coordinates, their coordinates. Accurate, his navigation officer told him, checking twice, to within 11 meters. Commander Veth Ra looked at the message for a long time. 11 meters. In open space, 11 meters was nothing, was less than nothing, was the kind of precision that required either very close proximity or very good sensors. His fleet had not been approached. His sensors had shown nothing, and yet someone, somewhere, knew exactly where his ships were, down to 11 meters, and had taken the time to tell him so. He told himself it was a bluff, a trick. The humans were broadcasting a position estimate and dressing it up as precision. He told himself this with some confidence. He did not turn the fleet around. The message went into the Conclave's public record within minutes of receipt, because the human diplomatic office apparently felt no need to keep it private. By the time Commander Veth Ra had finished his hot drink and decided the message was nothing to worry about, it had been read by diplomatic staff on 6 different worlds. The Velsani heard about it first. They always did. The Velsani were a species of patient, careful people who had been watching the galaxy's politics for 400 years and who had learned, over that time, that the small moments often mattered more than the large ones. An ambassador named Seal, stationed at the Conclave's main chamber on Vela Prime, read the message on her morning briefing and set her cup down very carefully. 11 meters, she thought. She pulled up the Jaqueth Transit Fleet's filed notification. Checked the timestamp. 3 hours before crossing. Not 72. She pulled up the human transmission timestamp. 6 hours after crossing. She sat for a while with those numbers, arranging them in her mind. Then she forwarded the message to her superior, with a note attached. Watching this one. Her superior, Ambassador Kale, read the note, read the message, and wrote back, "They're bluffing. The humans don't have that kind of sensor reach." He paused, then added, "Probably." Seal kept watching. In the conclave chamber that afternoon, there was a session on something unrelated, a trade dispute between two species on the far side of the galaxy. Commander Veth-Ra's fleet was mentioned briefly, almost as an aside, by the conclave's Secretary General, who noted that a notification violation had been formally logged. Several delegates laughed, not cruelly, just the small laughter of people who were not surprised. The Jaqueth cut corners. Everyone knew this. And humanity was humanity, quiet, harmless, unlikely to make noise about it. A Draveth delegate, large and blue-scaled and very old, leaned to his aide and murmured something. The aide whispered back. The delegate shook his head slowly, in the way of someone who had seen many small species discover, too late, what it cost to be ignored. But he said nothing to the chamber. On the 43rd Jaqueth warship, a young signals officer named Rhett was the one who had received and decoded the human transmission. She had done her job well, decoded it fast, passed it to the commander fast. But she had also done something else, something not quite in her job description. She had tried to find the source of the transmission. You could do that, sometimes, with directional signals. You could trace the angle of arrival, cross-reference it with known positions, and get at least a rough sense of where the sender was. She had done this carefully, quietly, while the commander was deciding the message was a bluff. The angle of arrival said the signal had come from approximately 40,000 kilometers off the fleet's port side. She had checked the sensor logs for that region. Clean. Nothing there. Not a ship, not a station, not so much as a debris cloud. She checked again. Still nothing. She sat with that for a while. Either the sensors were wrong, possible, sensors were not perfect, or there was something at 40,000 kilometers that the sensors simply were not seeing. She did not know which option she found more troubling. She filed a sensor diagnostic report and flagged it as routine. She did not tell Commander Veth-Ra. She was not sure what she would have told him. The fleet moved on. The corridor was still dark. The stars were still sparse. 14 hours ticked by, in the way that hours do in deep space. Slowly, emptily, with the particular silence that comes when you are very far from anywhere warm. At hour 13, a second message arrived. This one was shorter. It said only, 1 hour remaining in exit window. No deviations detected. No further action required at this time. No threat. No anger. Just a note. Like someone marking an entry in a logbook. Commander Veth-Ra read it in his command chair. His first officer stood beside him and said nothing. His communications officer had already forwarded it to the conclave record, because apparently that was something she was doing now, forwarding human transmissions to the public record without being asked, because she had decided it was the right thing to do, and no one had told her not to. The conclave received the second message during what would have been the end of the afternoon session. Ambassador Seal read it at her desk and felt something she could not quite name. It was not quite worry. It was something quieter than worry. The feeling you get when you realize that someone in a room has been watching you for longer than you noticed. The Jaqueth fleet exited the Kepler corridor 2 minutes before the stated window closed. Nothing happened. There was no confrontation, no weapons fire, no dramatic intervention. The 43 warships crossed back out of human space the same way they had crossed in, without incident, without ceremony, without any visible response from anyone. The corridor went quiet again. The sensors showed nothing. Commander Veth-Ra filed his post-transit report. He noted the two human transmissions as a footnote. He described them as posturing and unlikely to represent actual capability. He recommended no further action. He submitted the report and went to dinner. In the conclave chamber, the Zaketh consul, a smooth-faced diplomat named Hera, who had been in the job for 20 years and who prided herself on her composure, addressed the body during the evening session. She acknowledged the notification violation. She expressed, in the careful language of someone who was not going to apologize, her government's view that the Kepler corridor was not exclusively human space in any practical sense, and that the existing treaty language was ambiguous, and that the Dominion was committed to ongoing dialogue about corridor access. Several delegates nodded. Several did not. The Velsani ambassador Kale looked at his notes. The human delegation, 3 people, sitting in the back of the chamber as they always did, quiet as they always were, said nothing during the session. The lead delegate, a woman named Yara Osei, took notes. She had a very calm face. She had always had a very calm face. Seal, watching from across the chamber, had spent years trying to read that face and had never managed it. After the session ended, Seal crossed the chamber and stopped beside Delegate Osei. "We noticed your transmissions," Seal said. She meant it as an opening, a way to start a conversation. Osei looked up from her notes. "Good," she said. "Just that one word." Then she gathered her things and left. Seal stood in the empty chamber for a moment. She thought about 11 meters. She thought about a signal from a region of space that showed nothing on sensors. She thought about the exit window, 14.7 hours, and the fact that the fleet had exited 2 minutes before it closed, which meant the humans had known, ahead of time, almost exactly how long the transit would take. She thought about the phrase, "No further action required at this time." At this time. She walked back to her office and opened a new file on her terminal. She labeled it simply, Kepler Corridor Incident. She did not know yet what she would put in it. She suspected she would be adding to it for a long time. In the Dominion's eastern shipyards, the 43 warships arrived on schedule. The 11 days saved were noted in the logistics records. The fuel was unloaded. The weapons were transferred. The soldiers marched off their transports and went to their assignments. Commander Veth Ra wrote his report. He described a routine transit. He described the human messages as minor. He did not mention the 11-meter coordinates. He did not mention his signals officer's sensor anomaly. He submitted the report and went to sleep, and slept well, the way a man sleeps when he believes he has done something small and gotten away with it. In the galaxy at large, the incident had already been read by diplomatic offices on 11 worlds. Most of them had the same reaction the conclave chamber had. A small shrug, a mild interest, a note filed somewhere. But a few of them, the older ones, the careful ones, the ones who had been watching long enough to know that the quiet moments were the ones that mattered, did what Seal had done. They opened files. They wrote notes to themselves. They read the human transmission again, specifically the part about the exit window, specifically the part about the logged violation, specifically the words, "at this time." They sat with those words. None of them said anything to their governments yet. It was too early. There was nothing concrete to report. It was just a feeling, the kind that came from long experience with power, the sense that something had just happened that everyone else thought was nothing. The galaxy settled back into its noise. Somewhere, in the deep space of the Kepler corridor, whatever had known the exact position of 43 warships went back to being invisible. Nothing showed on the sensors. Nothing at all. And. Part 2. And. Ambassador Seal had been adding to her file for 9 days when the second incident began. The file was not long yet. It had the original transit notification, the 2 human transmissions, the conclave session transcript, some personal notes, and a short summary she had written for herself at 3 in the morning, after a night she could not sleep. The summary said only, "They knew. Find out what they know, and how." She had not yet found out. On the 9th day, the Zaketh Dominion filed a second transit notification. This one gave the required 72 hours. The notification was polite. It cited the treaty language and noted that the Kepler corridor, as a shared deep space passage, was accessible to all Conclave members under Article 14 of the Navigation Rights Agreement. The notification was filed correctly, stamped correctly, and distributed to all relevant parties. The human delegation received it at the same time as everyone else. Delegate Ose read it at her desk. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at the wall for a moment, and then she picked up her small comm unit and made a call. The call lasted 4 minutes. No one on the Conclave staff knew who she called, because she made it on a private channel, the kind that the Conclave technically allowed, but diplomatically discouraged. She filed no response to the notification. The required response period was 48 hours. In 47 hours and 59 minutes, with 60 seconds left on the clock, a single message arrived from the Human Diplomatic Office. It said, "Notification received. Article 14 review pending. Transit not approved. Vessels are advised not to enter the Kepler corridor, pending resolution of the ongoing violation record from the previous unauthorized transit. Estimated resolution timeline. Open." The Conclave's Secretary General read this message and immediately called an emergency session, because transit not approved was not language that appeared often in Conclave communications, and estimated resolution timeline, open, was language that had never appeared at all. The Jaqueth Consul Hera arrived at the session with her jaw set and her composure immaculate, and her eyes carrying a specific kind of anger that people carry when they have been publicly inconvenienced by someone they had not considered a threat. She argued that Article 14 did not grant veto rights. She argued that the previous transit, whatever its technical irregularities, had proceeded without incident. She argued that blocking a properly filed notification was itself a violation of the Navigation Rights Agreement. She argued all of this in a very precise, very sharp voice, and several delegates nodded along because she was not wrong, technically. The human delegation said nothing. Delegate Ose sat in the back and took notes. The session ended with a procedural decision to form a review committee. This was what the Conclave always did when it could not decide anything. It formed a committee. The committee would meet in 6 days. The Jaqueth transit was, for now, on hold. Consul Hera left the session and immediately contacted the Dominion government. The message she sent was marked urgent. The government's response came back in 4 hours. The response, stripped of its formal language, said, "Proceed anyway." The Jaqueth fleet, this one larger, 61 ships, a mixture of warships and supply transports, crossed into the Kepler corridor on the morning of the 3rd day after the session. Seal was at her desk when the alert came in. She was drinking tea. She put the tea down and opened the alert and read it, and then she opened her file and added a new entry. She labeled it Day 12. She wrote, "They went in. Now we find out." She did not know exactly what they were going to find out, but the feeling she had, that quiet, watching feeling from 9 days ago, had grown stronger since she read the phrase, "at this time," in the original transmission. She had been sleeping badly. She had been thinking about sensors that showed nothing. For the first 4 hours, nothing happened. The corridor was the same dark, cold passage it always was. The Jaqueth fleet moved in tight formation, their sensors running wide. If anything, they were more alert than last time. The consul had made sure of that. Every officer on every ship had been briefed on the previous transmissions. They were watching for signals. They were watching for anything. The 5th hour was when the Velsani observation ship first noticed the anomaly. The observation ship was the GCS Meridian, a Velsani diplomatic vessel that had been stationed near the corridor entrance as a matter of routine. The Meridian was not a military ship. It had no weapons. It had very good sensors, because Velsani diplomatic ships always had very good sensors, because information was the currency of their trade. The Meridian's sensor officer was a young woman named Tiv, who had been in her post for 2 years, and who had, in those 2 years, become quietly excellent at her job. She noticed the anomaly first as a shadow, not a reading, not a contact, just a faint irregularity in the ambient particle density of the corridor space, the kind of thing you only caught if you knew what normal looked like, and had been staring at it long enough to see the difference. She flagged it to the captain. The captain looked at it. "Could be debris," the captain said. "Could be," Tiv said. She did not think it was debris. Debris did not have that kind of density profile. Debris did not, in her experience, arrange itself in distributed patterns across a 40,000-kilometer spread. She kept watching. The human transmission came at hour 6. This one was different from the previous ones in tone. The previous ones had been administrative. This one was shorter. It said, "The Kepler corridor is closed. All Zaketh vessels are instructed to reverse heading immediately. This is not a request." No coordinates this time. No window. No footnotes about treaty violations. Commander Veth Ra, who was on this transit as well, because the Dominion Command had decided his experience with the corridor made him suitable, read the message in his command chair, and felt his mouth go dry. He did not know why exactly. The words were just words. "This is not a request," was the kind of thing you could say. It was just a sentence. But the previous transmission had known where his ships were to within 11 meters, and this one had come in the same format, from the same apparent source, and it said the corridor was closed. Not that it was requesting him to leave, not that there would be consequences, just that it was closed. Present tense. Fact. He ordered the fleet to hold position and opened a channel to the Zaketh command. He was going to request instructions. He had just opened the channel when his sensor officer made a sound. Not a word, just a sound. And he looked up. The corridor had ships in it. Not where the sensors had been watching. Everywhere. They appeared the way things sometimes appeared in space, when sensors swept past a certain angle. Not gradually, not as a slow emergence, but all at once, the way a picture snaps into focus. Dozens of contacts, spread across the corridor's full width, hanging at various ranges. He stared at the display. The ships did not look like anything in the Dominion's recognition database. They were human ships, had to be human ships, but they matched no known human hull type. They were dark, they were quiet. Every one of them was running cold. Minimum emissions, the way you ran a ship when you did not want to be seen, and had been not seen for a very long time. His sensor officer's voice was very careful when she spoke. "Sir, I'm reading 112 contacts. Correction, 119. Some of them are behind us." Behind them. He turned to look at the rear display. She was right. There were human ships between his fleet and the exit. Not many. 8, perhaps 10. But enough. Enough to mean that the corridor was not just ahead of him. The corridor was around him. On the meridian, Tiv's hands were moving fast over her console. The anomalies she had been watching, the particle density irregularities, had resolved into something she could now read clearly. She could see them on her sensors. All of them. She cross-checked numbers twice, and then pulled the captain over and showed her the display without saying anything. The captain said nothing for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, "How long have they been there?" "I don't know," Tiv said. "I started seeing the density profiles 9 days ago. If I had to guess." She stopped. "Guess," the captain said. "I think some of them have been in position for weeks," Tiv said. "Maybe more." The captain sat down. On the Meridian's recording system, which was running, because the Meridian always ran its recording systems in anything that looked interesting, and this had been looking interesting since day one. The full emergence was captured, every angle, every human ship appearing on sensors one by one, as they powered up to minimum visible emissions. It was not a dramatic video. There were no explosions, no weapon flashes, no dramatic maneuvering. It was just ships. Ships that had been there all along, invisible, waiting. The Velsani captain understood, watching that recording, that the question she needed to answer was not, what are the humans going to do? The question, the real question, the one that was going to matter for a very long time, was, how long ago did they decide to do it? The Zaketh fleet held position for 4 hours. No shots were fired. No weapons were powered up on either side. Or at least, no human weapons were visibly powered up. Commander Veth Ra sent 3 messages to the Dominion Command asking for instructions. He got 2 back. The first said, "Hold." The second said, "Do not fire first." He was not planning to fire at all. He was sitting in his command chair looking at 119 ships that had been invisible until they chose not to be. And he was thinking about something he had read in an intelligence briefing once, years ago, that he had not thought much about at the time. The briefing had noted that humanity had been surveying the Kepler corridor for 60 years. 60 years. He looked at the corridor walls on the display, the dark space around him, the sparse stars, and he thought about 60 years of survey data, 60 years of learning which debris fields could hide a ship and which couldn't, 60 years of refining sensors and stealth systems, and understanding exactly how a fleet of warships moved through a specific piece of space. He thought about the 11-meter coordinates. He thought about the phrase, "at this time." At hour 4, a third message arrived from the human side. It said, "Commander Veth Ra, your fleet may exit the corridor via the rear approach. The exit window is open. Safe passage is guaranteed for immediate and direct withdrawal. This offer remains valid for 6 hours." They knew his name. Of course they knew his name. He gave the order to withdraw. The fleet turned. Carefully, slowly, because you did not make fast movements when you were surrounded, and moved toward the rear exit. The human ships did not follow. They did not move at all. They simply watched, or whatever the equivalent was for ships running cold and dark. The Jaqueth fleet exited the corridor in 2 hours and 40 minutes. The corridor went quiet again. On the Meridian, the recording was already being transmitted to Velsani Diplomatic Command, with a note from the captain. Priority. Review before distribution. Do not release without senior authorization. She marked it priority because she had counted the ships. 119 human vessels, in the Kepler corridor, running invisible, and not one of them had been on any census. Not one of them had been on any registry. Not one of them appeared in any conclave database of human military assets. They had not been built in secret. Building 119 ships in secret was not possible, not for any species. They must have been registered somewhere, listed somewhere, accounted for in some human document that the conclave had simply never seen. The galaxy thought it knew what humanity's military looked like. The galaxy, the captain was beginning to understand, had been reading the wrong documents. Part 3. The Dominion went to war on a Tuesday. Not officially, not with any declaration. There were no speeches, no broadcast to the conclave, no message to the human diplomatic office. The Jaqueth Dominion did not believe in declarations. It believed in action, in the clean forward momentum of force applied before the other side could organize. It had won 6 wars this way, quickly, before anyone could stop it, before the conclave could convene a committee, before the losing side could call for allies. It sent 184 warships into the Kepler corridor. It did not send them through the registered entrance. It came in from 3 separate breach points, identified by the Dominion survey teams as locations where the corridor boundaries could be crossed without hitting the main monitoring routes. The Dominion's intelligence chief was proud of this plan. He had spent 11 days preparing it. He believed it was clever. On the 4th day of what the Dominion was calling, internally, the corridor resolution, Admiral Shen of the human military released a 4-word communication to her front command stations. They are inside. Begin. The Velsani observation ship Meridian was not in the corridor this time. The Velsani captain had moved her ship to a safe monitoring position on the corridor's outer edge, because she had watched the previous encounter, and she had a good sense for when things were about to become significantly less safe. From the outer edge, the Meridian sensors could cover the corridor mouth and a wide arc of approach space. She was watching when the human response started. It did not start with weapons. That was the first thing she noticed, watching the sensor feeds as they lit up with contact after contact. The human ships moved. They had been in position already. She suspected they had been in position for days, and they moved to cover positions, spreading out across the corridor exits and the breach points. But the first actions were not weapons fire. The first actions were electronic. The Meridian picked up a broad-spectrum signal burst, the kind that you sent when you wanted to reach every receiver in a large area simultaneously. The burst was in no language she recognized at first. It took the Meridian's translation system 40 seconds to identify it as a heavily encoded Jaqueth military communication format. Whatever the burst contained, it was aimed at the Jaqueth fleet's communication network. Tiv, still at her sensor station, looked at the signal analysis and frowned. "They just sent something into the Jaqueth comm network," she said. "Sent what?" the captain asked. I don't know. It's encoded in a format I've only seen in Jaketh military files. I didn't know the humans had access to. She stopped. Captain, I think they just changed the Jaketh encryption keys. The captain stared at her. They changed the keys on the enemy fleet's communication network, Tiv said slowly, as if she needed to hear herself say it. The Jaketh ships can still transmit, but they'll be transmitting on the wrong keys. To each other. They won't be able to read each other's messages. Not right away. Not until they reset the system. The captain sat down. How long does that take? For a fleet of this size? Tiv checked her database. Standard Jaketh protocol for emergency key reset is 6 hours. If they go manual, maybe 4. It requires every ship to be in direct line of sight communication to exchange the new keys, which means they have to drop formation, which means they can't coordinate, the captain said. For 4 to 6 hours, Tiv confirmed. Yes. There was a silence on the bridge of the Meridian. The captain thought about what it meant to know the enemy fleet's communication encryption keys. It meant you had access to those communications. It meant you had probably been reading those communications for some time. She thought about the 11-meter position accuracy from weeks ago. She thought about Commander Vethra's name appearing in the second corridor standoff. She thought about 119 ships that had been in position before the Jaketh even filed their second notification. She picked up her comm. She called the senior Velsani diplomatic attaché on Vela Prime. She said, I need to talk to Ambassador Kale. I need to talk to him in the next 20 minutes. This cannot wait. The battle, such as it was, lasted 93 days. The Conclave called it a conflict. Military analysts on 6 worlds called it a campaign. The Jaketh Dominion, in its internal documents, called it the Second Corridor Action. Delegate Osei, in the single report she filed with the human government during that period, called it the operational response. That was all. It was not a traditional war. There were no lines drawn on maps, no territories exchanged, no decisive battles where the two sides massed their fleets and crashed into each other. That kind of war required both sides to agree on how war was supposed to work. The Jaketh had a doctrine. They knew how war was supposed to work. The human military apparently had different ideas. In the first 2 weeks, the human forces did not attack a single Jaketh warship directly. What they attacked was everything else. The fuel depot at Station Keth 7, one of the Dominion's key refueling points for the Eastern Theater, lost its fuel in the 3rd day, not in an explosion. The fuel transfer lines were simply cut, at precisely the points where cutting them would be most difficult to repair, and the fuel vented into space in a slow, unrecoverable drift. The station crew was unharmed. The station itself was unharmed. The fuel was gone. 3 days later, the main relay hub that the Jaketh fleet used for long-range communication to the Dominion homeworld went offline. No weapons fire. The hub had been accessed remotely, and its routing tables had been overwritten. Everything still transmitted. It all went to the wrong places. It took the Dominion's Signals Corps 8 days to identify the problem, and another 6 to fix it. The Dominion's mobile shipyard tender, a massive vessel that served as the repair and resupply point for the Corridor fleet, found itself unable to fire its main drives on day 11. The engineering crew spent 3 days trying to diagnose the problem before they found it. 17, very small, very precisely placed devices attached to the fuel injection manifolds. Not bombs, not explosive at all, just small metal wedges, inserted into components, with a knowledge of Jaketh engineering so precise that they could only have come from someone who had studied those ships in significant detail. The tender was not destroyed. It was just stopped, parked, effectively, in the middle of space, unable to support the fleet it was supposed to serve. Admiral Kor, who commanded the Jaketh Corridor fleet, was an excellent officer. He had commanded forces in 2 previous wars. He knew how to fight. What he was having trouble doing was fighting something that would not meet him on the field. He wrote in his command log, on day 22, "We have engaged human forces directly on 3 occasions. In all 3 engagements, we achieved tactical success. The human units withdrew after limited exchange. In all 3 engagements, we subsequently discovered that the engagement itself appeared to be a diversion. While our forces pursued or consolidated after the engagement, other human units operated without interference against logistics targets. I am beginning to believe that the human command is deliberately inviting direct engagement as a means of drawing our attention away from the supply chain. This is not a doctrine I have encountered before. Standard doctrine says you fight for territory, or for the destruction of enemy forces. These forces seem to be fighting for something else. I have asked my intelligence chief to develop a counter-strategy. She has told me that she needs more time. She never got the time she needed. 11 days later, his intelligence chief's ship was boarded. Not attacked. Boarded. A small human team, how many, exactly, was never established, entered the Jaqueth intelligence vessel through an airlock that, according to the records, had not been opened. They spent approximately 4 hours on the ship, did not harm a single crew member, and left. What they took. The intelligence chief spent a week cataloging, was specific, only certain files, only certain data cores. Not the obvious ones, not the most prominent classified materials. The ones they took were the planning documents, the future logistics projections, the scheduled supply runs and their routes. After that, Admiral Corps' fleet began to feel the full weight of what was happening. Every resupply convoy ran into interference. Not ambushes. The human forces rarely attacked the convoys directly. The convoys ran into debris fields that had not been there before, placed in the most inconvenient possible locations. They ran into sensor ghost signals that required time-consuming investigation. They ran into communication blackouts at exactly the moments when they most needed to coordinate. They arrived to find that the stations they were heading to had, somehow, already been aware of their arrival time, and had, somehow, already had their access credentials changed. The Dominion sent more ships. The human forces absorbed them, worked around them, ignored the reinforcements entirely, and continued operating against the supply chain. At one point, Admiral Corps had over 300 warships in the corridor region. He felt, watching his sensor displays, like a man who had filled a dark room with soldiers to catch something that moved in the dark, and simply did not seem to care about the soldiers. In the conclave chamber, the sessions were nearly continuous. Consul Hera was fighting a political war alongside the military one, presenting arguments, presenting evidence, presenting the Jaqueth position as an aggrieved party defending its rights of transit. She was good at it. She was very good at it. The human delegation said very little. They answered direct questions in short sentences. They filed documentation. A great deal of documentation, actually. All of it carefully sourced. All of it precisely dated. The documentation was mostly records, logs of communications, sensor records, timestamps, the sort of thing that, taken together, painted a very clear picture of what had happened in the Kepler corridor over the past months. Seal read all of it. She added all of it to her file. Her file was now very thick. On day 61 of the campaign, something changed. It changed in the way things sometimes changed in long conflicts. Not dramatically, not with any single moment of collapse, but gradually, like a building that has been settling for years, finally showing a crack in the foundation. The Jaqueth fleet was still operational. It still had ships, it still had crew. But the things that made a fleet functional, the fuel, the parts, the communication, the repair capacity, the ability to plan and coordinate, were all degraded. Some were degraded badly. Admiral Corps filed a report to Dominion Command. He described the situation with the precision of a good officer who was not going to pretend things were better than they were. He listed his operational capability at 63%. He listed his fuel reserves at 41%. He listed his long-range communication reliability at 57%. He listed his mobile repair capacity at 12%, because the shipyard tender was still parked where it had stopped on day 11, and no repair team had managed to reach it safely. He also listed something that he put last, that he labeled observational note, in the way that officers put things last, and label them notes when they are not sure how their superiors will receive the information. It said, based on all available evidence, the human command had comprehensive advanced knowledge of our fleet deployment, our logistics chain, our communication protocols, and our operational doctrine before the beginning of this action. The 3-month timeline of this conflict has not been a campaign of adaptation on their part. It has been the execution of a plan prepared before we moved. I do not know how far in advance this plan was prepared. I do not know what other plans may exist. I am recommending a review of all Dominion systems that may have been accessed by human intelligence services over the past decade. He submitted the report and waited. The response from Dominion Command came on day 68. It said, "Maintain current positions. Political resolution anticipated." He read those words and looked at his fuel reserves and thought about the shipyard tender sitting cold in deep space, and he understood what political resolution anticipated meant. It meant the people sending him orders had run out of military options and were hoping the diplomats could do something. He hoped they were right. On day 79, his sensor officer flagged something new, a contact, at the very edge of sensor range, that had been there for 3 days without moving. It was running cold, no emissions. If his sensors had been even slightly less capable, he would not have seen it at all. He stared at the contact for a long time. It was not a human warship. The profile was wrong. He ran it against every database his intelligence team had. Velsani diplomatic configuration. There was a Velsani ship sitting at the edge of his sensor range, watching. He thought about that. He thought about who else might be watching. He thought about the thick files of documentation the human delegation had been filing with the conclave, and the precise timestamps on all of it, and the way Delegate Osei's face never changed when she delivered any of it. On day 93, the Dominion government contacted the conclave and requested mediation. The human delegation received the request. Delegate Osei read it. She set it down. She picked up her small comm unit and made a 4-minute call, the same as before. Then she filed a 1-line response. Mediation accepted. Human precondition. Full withdrawal of all Jaqueth forces from human space before talks begin. The Jaqueth forces were fully withdrawn within 11 days. The corridor went quiet. The war, the conflict, the operational response, was over. Admiral Corps' final log entry was brief. It said, "I have commanded forces in 2 wars. I have never fought an enemy that seemed, at every stage, to be fighting a different war than the one I thought we were in. This was not a failure of tactics. This was not a failure of courage. This is a failure I do not yet have a word for." He thought about it for a long time after, and never found the word. Part 4. Lun. The mediation session was scheduled for a neutral station, the conclave's secondary diplomatic hub on Orbital Platform 9, a structure built specifically for the kind of talks that were too delicate for the main chamber on Vela Prime. It had private meeting rooms, secure communication lines, and a long history of hosting negotiations between species that were trying to stop disliking each other enough to sign something. Both delegations arrived on time. The Jaqueth delegation was led by Consul Hera. She came with 12 advisors, 3 legal experts in conclave treaty law, and the kind of prepared composure that said she had spent the 11 days of withdrawal doing nothing but getting ready for this room. She sat down on her side of the table and arranged her documents, and looked across at the human delegation. The human delegation was 4 people: Delegate Osei, 2 aides, and a quiet man in the back whose function nobody had bothered to explain. No stacks of documents, no visible preparation. Osei had a single thin data pad on the table in front of her. Hera waited for the formal exchange of credentials. Standard procedure. Each delegation confirmed its authority to speak for its government, confirmed the terms of the mediation, confirmed that whatever was agreed in this room would be considered binding. Osei confirmed all of this in 3 sentences. The mediator, a senior Velsani diplomat named Ran, chosen because the Velsani were trusted to be neutral, and because Ran specifically had a reputation for keeping difficult sessions from collapsing, introduced the agenda. First item, the terms of the conflict resolution. Second item, corridor access going forward. Third item, reparations. "Before we begin," Ran said, "I am required to confirm that both delegations have received the pre-session documentation package." He looked at Hera. She nodded. She had received the package. Her legal team had reviewed it. He looked at Osei. "We have no documentation to submit," Osei said. "We will be submitting the documentation during this session." Ran paused. This was not standard. Documentation was supposed to be submitted before the session, so both sides had time to review it. He said so. "I understand," Osei said. "This is acceptable to us. If the Jaqueth delegation would prefer to delay the session to allow review time." We have no objection. Hera looked at her legal team. She looked back at Osei. She said no. The session should proceed. She said this with the confidence of someone who had reviewed the Jaqueth position thoroughly and believed it was sound. Osei nodded. She tapped her data pad. What came out of the pad was not a document. It was a file package, transmitted directly to every screen in the mediation room, to the conclave record, and, Hera realized with a cold feeling in her chest, to a distribution list that appeared to include the diplomatic offices of every species currently holding conclave observer status. She stared at that distribution list. It had 47 names on it. "What is this?" she said. "The record," OCA said simply. The record was 3,847 pages. Hera's lead legal advisor, a sharp woman named Cress who read fast, started scanning, and kept scanning, and kept scanning. The room waited. Rand the mediator looked at his own copy with the careful expression of someone who had learned, in 30 years of diplomacy, to keep his face still when something surprised him. The record began with the original Kepler corridor transit notification, the 3-hour filing that should have been 72 hours. It included the 2 transmissions from the first incident, with full technical annotations on the position accuracy data. It included the Meridian sensor logs from the second corridor standoff, with timestamp analysis, and a technical note from a human signals expert, explaining how the invisible ships had been positioned and for how long. Then, it went into the conflict itself. The record of the 93-day campaign was the longest section. It was not just a list of engagements, it was annotated. Every action that human forces had taken was noted with its timestamp, its location, and this was the part that made Cress stop reading and look up at her console. Its stated reason in the operational plan. The human forces had been operating from a written plan. The plan was dated. The plan was dated 14 months before the conflict began. Cress said, in a very low voice, "Consul, the plan was written before we filed the first transit notification." Hera did not respond. She was looking at another section of the record, the communication intercepts section. The Human Intelligence Services had been reading Jaqueth military communications for 6 years. The record did not say how. It did not explain the technical methods. It simply provided, as evidence, selected intercepts, 47 of them, spanning the 6-year period, each one tagged with the date it was received and the date it was acted upon. The intercepts included discussions of the Kepler Corridor Transit Plan. They included the internal Dominion assessment of humanity as a low threat. They included Admiral Corps' planning documents for the corridor campaign. They included a private message from Consul Hera to her government, sent 4 days before the Dominion went to war, in which she had described humanity as a manageable problem and recommended firm action. Hera looked at that intercept for a long time. Osei said nothing. She had not said anything for 40 minutes. She sat with her hands in her lap and her face very calm, and waited for the room to finish reading. The final section of the record was the cost summary. It was presented simply, in plain numbers. Jaqueth casualties over the 93-day period, 231 million. Capital vessels lost or disabled, 19. Shipyard facilities damaged or destroyed, 12. Fuel reserves depleted, estimated 60% below pre-conflict levels. Estimated economic recovery timeline, 60 to 80 standard years. Underneath those numbers was a single line. It said, "Cause of conflict, unauthorized transit of human space. Notification lead time, 3 hours. Required lead time, 72 hours. Discrepancy, 69 hours." Hera read that line. She read it again. The number sat on the page, 2.31 million, 19 capital vessels, 12 shipyards, 60 to 80 years, and next to it, in the cause column, just 69 hours. The mediator Rand was very still. He had 30 years of experience. He had seen many documentation packages and mediation sessions. He had never seen one that was going to be received simultaneously by 47 diplomatic offices across the galaxy, before the session was even finished. He cleared his throat. "Delegate Osei, I need to note that the simultaneous distribution of this material to observer delegations is our right," Osei said, not unkindly, just as a fact. "All conclave parties have the right to submit evidence to the public record during mediation. We are submitting to the public record. We are notifying observer parties as is standard practice for cases with broad implications for corridor access rights. She paused. Article 31, subsection 4. Rand checked. She was correct. Hera's legal team was very quiet. Cress was still reading. She had reached the communication intercepts section and had gone a particular color. This is, Hera started. Accurate, Osei said. Another pause. You're saying all of this is accurate? Yes, Osei said. If the Jaketh delegation wishes to contest any specific item in the record, we will provide primary source documentation for that item. We have everything. She let that land. Everything. The room was very quiet. Somewhere in 47 diplomatic offices, people were reading. Seal was one of them. She was at her desk on Vela Prime, and the file package had come through on her terminal, and she was reading it with a cup of tea. She had forgotten to drink, going cold at her elbow. She read the intercept section. She read the operational plan date. She read the cost summary. She sat back in her chair. She thought about every conversation she had ever had about humanity in her 20 years of diplomatic service. The conversations in which humanity was described as quiet, as minor. The conversations in which senior diplomats had waved off her early concerns about the Kepler corridor incident. The conversation in which Ambassador Kale had said, probably, and meant it as a reassurance. She thought about the cost summary. 2.31 million casualties, 60 to 80 years, for 69 hours of notification. She did not think humanity was saying the cost was proportionate. She thought humanity was saying something different, and colder, and much more important. It was saying, this is what the math looks like. This is what happened. Here are the numbers. We are not telling you what to think about the numbers. We are telling you the numbers exist, and now every diplomatic office in the galaxy has them, and you can do your own arithmetic. In the mediation room, Hera had recovered some of her composure. She was a very experienced diplomat. She began to argue about the proportionality of the response, about the 6-year intelligence operation as a violation of sovereignty, about the distribution of the material to observer parties as a political maneuver. She made good arguments. Her legal team supported her well. Osei listened to all of it. She answered questions when asked. When Hera finished her initial argument, Osei said, "We are prepared to discuss all of these points. We have documentation supporting our position on each of them. We suggest beginning with the corridor access terms, as those are most directly relevant to preventing a recurrence. We have a proposed framework." She transmitted the framework. It was 2 pages. It said essentially, file at least 72 hours in advance. Receive approval. Enter. Do not file or do not receive approval. Do not enter. Violation consequences. On record. On record meaning what? Hera said. Meaning on record, Osei said. As this incident is now on record, the conclave will have a complete accounting. The observer parties will have a complete accounting. The math is available to everyone. Math is available to everyone. Hera looked at her legal team. She looked back at Osei. You are saying future violations will be treated the same way, documented and distributed. Yes, Osei said. Whether or not there is a military response. The documentation and the military response are separate questions, Osei said. The documentation is automatic. The military response depends on the nature of the violation. We are quite good at telling the difference between a mistake and a choice. The silence after that sentence lasted a long time. In 47 diplomatic offices, people were still reading. In some of those offices, people had stopped reading the Jaketh sections entirely and had started going back through their own records, pulling up their own transit histories through human space, reviewing their own past notifications, checking timestamps. The Draveth delegate who had sat in the conclave chamber at the very beginning of this, who had shaken his head slowly and said nothing, he was reading now. He read the intercept section twice. He looked at the operational plan date. He thought about the last time his own people had passed through a registered human trade corridor. He thought about whether they had filed the full 72 hours. They had. He was fairly certain they had. He pulled the record anyway, just to be sure. The mediation session lasted 6 more hours. At the end of it, both delegations signed the corridor access framework. Hera signed with her face perfectly composed. She was a professional. Osei signed with the same calm expression she always had. As they were leaving, Ran the mediator fell into step beside Osei for a moment. He said, quietly, so only she could hear, "The distribution list. 47 offices. That was deliberate." "Yes," she said. "The message was not for the Jaqueth," he said, "not as an accusation, just as an observation." "The Jaqueth needed to sign the framework," Osei said. "The 47 offices needed to see the record." She paused, briefly. "They are different needs." Ran walked beside her for another few steps. He was a very experienced diplomat. He had negotiated settlements between empires. He thought he understood, now, what had happened in the past 3 months. He thought the Jaqueth had walked into a room that humanity had been building for 6 years, and the door behind them had been the 47 offices. And the room was not a mediation room at all. It was a lesson. He did not say this to Osei. He was not sure she would confirm it. But he noted it, carefully, in his own private record, the way that people who had been watching long enough always noted the things that mattered. Part 5. The conclave convened its full session 3 weeks after the mediation. This was not unusual. Full sessions happened 6 times a year, scheduled in advance, and this one had been on the calendar for months. What was unusual was the attendance. Full sessions typically drew around 60% of eligible delegations in person, with the rest participating remotely. This one drew 94% in person. The hall was packed in a way it had not been packed in years. The session had 17 items on the agenda. The Kepler Corridor Framework was number 6. Items 1 through 5 took their usual time. Trade disputes, border surveys, a resource rights question involving a species that nobody in the room cared about very much. Seal sat in the Velsani section and watched the chamber, and noted, as she always did, who was watching whom. There was more lateral watching than usual, delegates glancing at other delegates, small whispered conversations in the aisles during the trade dispute discussion. The chamber had the particular energy of a room full of people who had all read the same document, and were waiting to talk about it. Item 6 was called. The Secretary General introduced the Kepler Corridor Access Framework, summarized its 2-page contents for the record, and noted that it had been signed by both parties, and was therefore considered ratified under existing conclave treaty law. The framework would be entered into the official navigation rights record. Did any delegation wish to speak? 22 delegations wished to speak. The first 3 were predictable. Formal statements of support for the peaceful resolution, careful diplomatic language, the usual vocabulary. Then the Draveth delegate stood up. He was very old. He had been in conclave politics for 40 years and he said very little, and when he spoke, people generally listened. He said, "I want to address something that is not in the framework document, but that I believe this body needs to discuss directly. The mediation record, the 3,847-page package distributed during the session." The chamber got quieter. People who had been paying partial attention shifted to full attention. "I have read all of it," the Draveth delegate said. "My staff has read all of it. The intelligence section, specifically. I want to ask the human delegation a direct question." He turned to look at the human delegation. Delegate OCI was in her usual seat, the back row, the quiet spot. She looked back at him with her usual calm face. "The communication intercepts in that record spanned 6 years," he said. "They are from the Jaqueth military network. I want to ask, not as an accusation, as a question, whether the human diplomatic and intelligence services maintain similar access to the communication networks of other conclave members." The chamber was very still. Osei let the silence sit for a moment. Then she said, "That is a question about operational intelligence methods. We don't discuss those in open session." The Draveth delegate nodded slowly. "I understand. I expected that answer." He paused. "I want the conclave to note that I asked the question, and I want the conclave to note the answer." He sat down. Several delegates were very carefully not looking at the human delegation. Several others were very carefully looking at them. Seal was looking at OC. OC was looking at her datapad. The next 5 speakers gave their statements. None of them asked the same question the Draveth delegate had asked, but several of them mentioned, in various ways, that the navigation rights framework was clear and straightforward, and their governments were committed to full compliance with notification requirements. One delegate, from a species called the Mevith, who had a stretch of contested space on the outer rim and a history of creative interpretations of corridor access rules, said his government wished to submit a retroactive review of all its corridor transit filings from the past 8 years. He said this in a very flat voice. He said his government wanted to ensure all filings were complete and accurate. He said the review would be submitted to the conclave record within 60 days. A few delegates shifted in their seats when he said this. A few did not move at all. Seal wrote a note on her pad. Mevith retroactive review. First, she suspected they would not be the last. The human delegation was invited to speak. Osei stood. She thanked the conclave for the full session and for the opportunity to present the framework. She noted that the framework was not complicated and that her government hoped it would become standard. She said her government remained committed to open corridor access for all species that followed the notification requirements. She said that human space was, as it had always been, available to everyone. She sat down. She had spoken for 90 seconds. The session moved on to item 7, which was a boundary survey question in the outer spiral. Nobody was paying very much attention to item 7. The chamber had the slightly dazed quality of a room that has absorbed something large and is still processing it. During the break between items 7 and 8, Seal crossed the chamber floor to the human section. She had done this before. She did it because she had been adding to her file for months now, and because she had learned, over that time, that the small moments, the side conversations, the comments that did not go into the record, were the ones that told you what was actually happening. Osei was talking to one of her aides when Seal approached. She finished the sentence she was saying to the aide, then looked up. "Ambassador," Osei said. "Delegate," Seal said. She stopped beside the table. "I wanted to tell you something, if you have a moment." Osei waited. "I opened a file the morning after the first transit incident," Seal said. "The 11-meter coordinate message. I labeled it Kepler Corridor Incident. I have been adding to it since then." She paused. "It is very thick now." Osei looked at her. "I know," she said. Seal had expected that. She said, "What I wanted to tell you is that when I opened that file, I thought I was watching something begin. The first few pages, the first few weeks, I thought this was an incident that was going to develop." She stopped. "And now," Osei said. "And now I think I was watching something that had already been running for a long time," Seal said. "I think the file I opened was already almost full. I just didn't have access to the earlier pages." Osei looked at her for a moment. It was the first time, in all the months Seal had been watching her face, that she thought she saw something move behind it. Not much. A very small thing. Something that might have been acknowledgement, or respect, or just the recognition of one careful person by another. "You're a good diplomat, Ambassador," Osei said. "I'm a slow one," Seal said. Osei almost smiled. Seal was not certain. The break ended, and the session resumed, and they both went back to their seats. In the weeks that followed the session, things changed. Not dramatically. Not in the way that wars change things, or treaties signed in public ceremony change things. It was quieter than that. The change was the kind that happened in the spaces between official events, in the decisions that didn't make it into the record. The Mevith submitted their retroactive corridor filing review. 6 other species submitted similar reviews in the following month, unprompted. 3 species that had pending transit applications for human space corridors resubmitted them with longer notification lead times than required. Not the 72 hours, but 100, 120, one of them 200 hours. A mid-sized military power called the Veth Collective quietly began a review of their corridor treaties with every species they shared borders with. The review was internal. It did not make the conclave record. But the Velsani diplomatic service had good sources, and Seal heard about it, and added it to her file. The Jaqueth Dominion was very quiet. Consul Hera gave no public statements. The Dominion government, as far as Seal's sources could determine, had entered a period of significant internal review. Economic, military, political. The 60 to 80-year recovery timeline from the cost summary appeared to be taken seriously at the highest levels of Dominion government. There were, her sources said. A great number of internal meetings. There were no further transit notifications filed for the Kepler corridor by the Dominion. There were no transit notifications filed by anyone for 6 months. Then a Velsani cargo convoy filed, correctly, 103 hours ahead. They received an automated approval within the hour. They transited without incident. The acknowledgement they received on exit was 3 lines: confirmation of exit, confirmation of clearance, and 1 additional sentence. The sentence said, "Safe travels." Seal read about the Velsani convoy's transit in her morning briefing. She read the acknowledgement. She sat with the phrase, "Safe travels," for a moment. It was such a small thing to say. It was such a precise thing to say. Not, "You may proceed," or "transit approved," or any of the formal language of corridor navigation. Just, "Safe travels." The kind of thing you said to someone you had decided was not a threat, and whom you were genuinely happy to see moving safely through a piece of space you cared about. It was, she thought, the most human thing they had said through the entire incident. She added it to her file. The file was very thick now. She had been thinking about turning it into a report, a proper diplomatic analysis, something to give to the senior staff, something to hand to Ambassador Kale and let him read with his morning tea. She had been thinking about it for weeks. She had not done it yet. She was not sure why. She thought it was because she had the feeling, not quite superstitious but not quite rational either, that the file was not finished, that something else was still coming. She did not know what. On the Zaketh ship that was being decommissioned in the 3rd week of that month, one of the 19 capital vessels listed as lost or disabled in the cost summary, now being stripped for parts at a Dominion salvage yard, there was a signals officer. Her name was Rhett. She was the one who had tried to trace the source of the first human transmission, back at the very beginning, and found a signal coming from a sector of space that showed nothing on sensors. She had been assigned to the decommissioning detail as part of her unit's post-conflict reassignment. It was not interesting work. She cataloged components. She filed inventory reports. She spent a lot of time in the cold, stripped corridors of a ship that had once felt powerful, and now felt like exactly what it was, a thing being taken apart. She found the file on a day when she was clearing the last of the intelligence records from the ship's secure storage. It was a small file, something her old commander had started and never expanded. It contained a note about the first transit, the sensor diagnostic she had filed as routine, and a single calculation she had added herself at the time and then forgotten about. She looked at the calculation. It was the signal trace from the first transmission, the source position, the 40,000-kilometer offset, and next to it, in her own handwriting from months ago, a question she had written to herself and then put away. If they had a ship there, why didn't we see it? She had not had an answer then. She had it now, or something close to it, after 93 days of a campaign that had been full of ships they couldn't see, and plans that were already written, and positions that were already taken. They couldn't see it because it was designed not to be seen. She sat with that. In the cold, stripped corridor of a being dismantled ship, surrounded by the inventory of a conflict that had cost 2.31 million of her people, and 60 to 80 years of recovery, and 12 shipyards and 19 ships, including this one. She did the math. If they had that kind of stealth capability, the kind that could hide a ship at 40,000 kilometers from a military fleet's active sensors, and if they had been using it in the Kepler corridor, and if the corridor was, as all the evidence suggested, a place they had been watching closely for 60 years, how many ships were in the corridor right now? Not the registered ones, not the ones on any census, the others, the ones running cold and dark, sitting in debris fields, and at safe distances from monitoring routes, doing what they had apparently always been doing. She did not know the answer. She could not calculate it. There was not enough data. But she thought about the phrase she had seen in the mediation record, which had been distributed to the whole Dominion military for review. The phrase from Delegate Osei at the very end of the session, when she said, "We are quite good at telling the difference between a mistake and a choice." She thought about what it took to be good at telling that difference. What you needed, the sensors, the position data, the communication access. the 60 years of survey knowledge, the ships you could not see. She thought about the 47 diplomatic offices that had received the mediation package. She thought about the corridor access framework that was now on record for every species in the conclave. She thought about the Mevith and their retroactive review, and the 3 species that had filed with 200 hours of lead time, and the Veth Collective reviewing their treaties quietly in a room somewhere. She thought about the math that everyone in the galaxy now had access to. The receipt, 231 million, 60 to 80 years, 12 shipyards, all for 69 hours. Nobody had told the galaxy that humanity was dangerous. They had just shown the galaxy what happened when someone decided they weren't. She closed the file. She filed her inventory report. She went back to work in the cold corridor, cataloging the pieces of a ship that had once been powerful, in a war that had already been planned before it started, against a species that was still out there, quiet, watchful, invisible where they needed to be, in space that had always been theirs. The corridor was dark. The sensors showed nothing. And somewhere in the galaxy, in 47 offices and more, people were doing the math.